Hi everyone, this is Sadaf Khosravifar. I'm a senior engineer at IMS Infrastructure Management Services, and today I will be talking about compaction quality assurance of unbound material using the lightweight deflectometer. First LWDs were developed in 1970s, and they were specifically designed for testing unbound or partially bound material, and they're great in situ tools for measuring that surface modulus, which is basically the response of the underlying layers to the dynamic stress that is applied by the LWD. LWD is a simple tool. It has a plate, it has a falling weight, there's usually a geophone or an accelerometer, which is basically a sensor to give us a deflection in the center of the plate. And some LWDs, such as the Dynatest LWD, also have load cell. They come with different plate sizes or additional weights and additional geophones, and they can provide us with more information, such as the nonlinearity of the soil. They can provide us with the modulus of a two-layer system. We can calculate the required overlay to meet design specs. We can identify the weak areas, weak spots, and ultimately use them for quality control purposes, which is the main topic that I want to talk about. So our objective with this study, which was funded by Federal Highway Administration Pooled Fund study TPF 5-285, was to develop a spec that is straightforward, simple, and repeatable for compaction quality assurance of unbound material using LWD. And my colleague Nusha Afshariki and I work under supervision of Professor Chuck Schwartz at University of Maryland. 8 different states were part of this study to develop such a spec, and we wanted it to be a smooth transition from density-based methods to modulus-based methods. We wanted it to be applicable to a variety of geomaterials. We wanted it to be cost-effective for organizational implementation, and we wanted it to be based on field, moisture, and modulus measurements immediately after compaction. Well, it goes without saying that there are certain challenges involved in developing a suitable, practical, LWD-based QA process. We need to be aware of different issues. We know that we are dealing with geomaterial, and the modulus of geomaterial tend to be stress-dependent, moisture-dependent, and they tend to be affected by the layered structure of the pavement. So the process that we developed should be able to consider all of these important elements. And besides that, with the LWD, we are measuring the modulus of the material, but we also need to find a device that we can measure the moisture content of the material, and we need to have a device that is repeatable and gives us speedy results in for the moisture measurements in the field, because moisture is one of the major factors that affect the modulus of the material. The process that we developed and subsequently validated basically involved a few steps. The first step was to take the LWD and do some LWD testings on top of a Proctor mold. Actually, the idea came from Mr. Larry Olson of Olson Engineering. He suggested, well, everyone has a Proctor mold, but if we put the LWD on top of it to do some modulus measurements. So that's what we did, and the process includes that. We place the LWD on top of the Proctor mold, we measure the stiffness of the material on top of the mold, and we do the testing in conjunction with the Proctor testing for density measurement. So we will be doing the testing at multiple moisture contents, and it's also ideal to do it at different drop heights, so we can apply different pressures to the material, and we take all of this information to establish a target modulus for our field measurements. And again, that target needs to be a function of moisture, stress or pressure, and the layered structure that we have in the field. And then we are going to use that same LWD and measure the modulus of the material in the field, and as well as its moisture content, and use our compaction criteria and require that the ratio of the modulus of the material in the field to the target modulus be greater than our set threshold. Let's say it's 1. And we also want the moisture content to be within a certain range of the optimal moisture content in the same way that we currently have our QA methods. We also have implemented a parameter called Pwl Percentage within limit, and that's also the agency decision on what the PWL should be. But for example, if we set it at 80%, that means that we want our test points to pass the compaction criteria at least in 80% of the times. All right, so let's take a look at the components of the process now. Well, as I mentioned, the first step is to do LWD testing on proctor mold. As you can see here, I have the formula to calculate the modulus of the material in the mold, and it's based on the theory of elasticity. It considers the cylinder of an elastic material with constrained lateral movement imposed by the rigid mold, because we know there is no lateral movement. The mold is rigid and all of our deflection is from the top, and it's a uniform deflection from the top. The formula, which is derived from elastic theory, is a function of Poisson's ratio, geometry of the mold, the height of the mold, and of course it's a function of the stress and deflection that we measure with the LWD. It's recommended to do the testing on top of a 150 millimeter mold. We found it to be more stable, and the idea with all of these is to match the pressure in the field. So as you can imagine, with a smaller plug diameter, we need to drop the drop height significantly, and we have come to the conclusion that a drop height of around 10 centimeters will provide us with a pressure of about 95 kilopascals, which is a similar pressure as if we go in the field and do measurements from a full drop height. But it's completely recommended to do measurements at multiple drop heights so that we can interpolate and exactly match the pressure that we are getting in the field, because at the end it's very important to be able to test in the lab and in the field at the same pressure and at the same moisture content. The graph that I'm showing is one of the examples of how the test looks like. The pink graph is the dry density, and as you can see, as the moisture increases, we get to a maximum dry density, and then when we increase the moisture content again, the dry density decreases over time. But as you can see, all the other graphs show the modulus on top of the proctor mold, and they consistently decrease as we increase the moisture content. So that is why moisture content is super important, because when we go in the field and measure the moisture content, we need to come back to this graph and read the target modulus, because as you can see, the modulus of the material is significantly affected by the moisture content. All right, so the next step is to go to the field for a semi-infinite test setup, such as testing on top of a subgrade. It's easy. We follow the boostiness equation as I'm showing over here, and we also need to determine the moisture content. As part of the study, we have looked at different devices to capture the moisture content via non-nuclear methods, and one of the devices that we ended up liking a lot was the OHAS moisture analyzer. Is basically a scale with a halogen lamp that basically dries the sample in the field, and you can see it has a small screen that shows the drying in the field and shows the moisture content, and it's pretty fast. It dries the samples in like 20 minutes, so it's a suitable device for the field application. Again, the modulus in the field is a function of Poisson's ratio, the geometry of the plate, the radius of the plate, and the stiffness that we get from the LWD, which is our stress and our deflection. There's also a parameter that we assume. It's the stress distribution factor, which is kind of the stress under the plate of the LWD, the stress that is induced to the soil. And there are certain assumptions for granular material. It's recommended to use the parabolic soil plate system stress distribution factor. For sandy material, stress distribution factor of 2, which is an indicator of a uniform stress distribution is recommended, and all of these come from Terzaghi, and he did a lot of research back in the times to look at the interaction of the plate and the soil, and these are recommendations from Terzaghi on how the stress is actually distributed to the soil. And for clay cohesive material, an inverse parabolic is something that we expect to see, so therefore the pi/2 is a recommended stress distribution factor to be used for this type of material. All right, so for one layer system, it was easy. We do the testing in the lab on top of the Proctor mold, and we go in the field, we use a boostiness equation. We just need to make sure that the stress and the moisture are the same, and that way we can compare apples to apples, the field measurements with the targets from the mold measurement. With a 2-layer system, however, it's a little bit more complicated because we know the field measurements with the targets from the mold measurement. With a 2-layer system, however, it's a little bit more complicated because we know that the modulus of the top layer will be affected by the modulus of the underlying layer whenever we put the LWD on top and we do a modulus determination. That's kind of the surface modulus, which is a composite modulus of whatever is in its zone of influence. So it will get affected by the modulus of the underlying subgrade, especially if we have a thin base layer, and therefore we need to correct for that. And to handle that, we use the solution developed by Burmester in 1950s. He developed this lengthy equation to calculate the stresses and displacements in a 2-layer pavement system. And as you can see, it's a function of the modulus of each layer, the thickness of the top layer, and the radius of the plate. So the idea is we get the target modulus of the top layer from LWD on mold, and the modulus of the subgrade is something that we need to measure in the field prior to placement of the base layer, and then this way we can correct the target modulus for the surface layer, and when we do LWD measurements in the field, we can compare those values with this corrected target value. So that was the process, and we did a lot of testing. We test drove the approach in some large-scale experiments at Federal Highway Administration, the Turner Fairbank Highway Research Center. We carefully designed and constructed 3 test pits at target moisture and density conditions to kind of simulate the scenarios for acceptable and failed compaction quality. And in designing and constructing the pits, we used 2 different soil types. We use a cohesive and a non-cohesive subgrade soil, and then we use one type of granular aggregate base. We ran a comprehensive set of different tests to work out some of the details of the procedure. And I can talk for a long time on these experiments, but I think I prefer to move on to the actual field validations. So as part of the pooled fund study, we visited several sites throughout the participating agencies. The sites were across Virginia, Maryland, New York, Indiana, Missouri, Florida, and it contained different soil types, subgrade soil, cement modified subgrades, granular aggregate bases, and it included a variety of AASHTO classified soil types. And the purpose of this was to basically validate and fine-tune our methodology. There was also another follow-up study in the state of Maryland, and we looked at a bunch of different sites in Maryland as well. And here are some of the results we were hoping to find, and we actually found in these studies that there is actually a very good correlation between the pass-fail criteria that we get from density-based measurements and the modulus-based measurements. If you look at this graph, I have the percentage compaction, which comes from nuclear gauge on the vertical axis, and the modulus ratio that comes from LWD, which is the field versus normalized by the target modulus on the horizontal axis. And we could see that on the sites that the compaction criteria was failed by the density methods, we also were getting ratios below 1 from our modulus-based methods. And then on the sites that we passed the density criteria, we also passed the modulus criteria. And the same thing also happened with the Maryland study. We could see very consistently see that in the sites that we had failed the density measurements, we also failed the modulus measurements, and vice versa. Whenever we passed the density measurements, we also passed the modulus-based measurements. And by the way, the modulus ratio of 1 that I have that I'm showing here, it doesn't really have to be equal to 1. It's basically the same way that we set the density criteria. For example, some agencies require 95% compaction, some agencies require 98% compaction. It's basically similar to that. So it would be the agency's decision on what that threshold needs to be. And they can make that decision by looking at plots such as this to see where they should draw that line. So the outcome of all of these studies are implemented into 2 AASHTO-like processes. We have developed one procedure in AASHTO format for lab testing, and determining the target modulus in the lab, and another one for compaction quality control using LWD in the field. These specifications are also in the process with the ASTM committee to become an ASTM standard. And to add some news, I recently heard from Mr. Javier Castañeda that these specifications are also approved by the Mexican Institute of Transport. So this proctor method is fully implemented and it can be used. And to make it even easier, Dynatest LWD has developed an app that goes very well with the spec. The Dynatest LWD also has this laser engraved scale on the shaft with a movable release handle. So it's very easy to set the desired drop height, which is required. We need to have a very low drop height for lab testing, and we need to have a higher full drop height for the field testing. So the engraved scale on the shaft really makes it easy to set those desired drop heights. The Dynatest LWD also has a very easy system to switch between the plate sizes. It's called the dual plate system. Doesn't need any screws or screwdrivers. You can just easily switch the plate from a 6-inch or 150 millimeter plate to a 300 millimeter plate. And we know that for the lab testing, we need the 150, while in the field, the 300 millimeter plate is the one to go most of the times. I mean, you could also, on some material, you may need, based on the stiffness of the material, to use the 200 millimeter plate, but usually the 300 millimeter plate is the plate of choice for field testing. The app also includes built-in models for testing on mold and in the field, so you can easily go in and select your test method, and it does all the calculations. It has implemented all the formulas, and it will use the correct formula to calculate the modulus in the field and in the lab. And it also supports 4 different compaction criteria. So 2 of them are what we discussed here: the modulus-based compaction criteria for a 1-layer system, and the corrected modulus criteria for the 2-layer system. Those are implemented, and then moreover, there are 2 additional ones that are just based on deflection. One is deflection. You could set a maximum threshold for a deflection, and you can set the criteria in a way that, if the deflections are higher than a certain number, then it means fail. If they're lower than a certain number, it means pass. So you could use that directly without any modulus determination, and some specifications throughout the US actually just go with the pure deflection. So that's also supported in the app. And the last one is a delta deflection. That one is actually something that is supported and is implemented in an existing ASTM standard. It's ASTM E2583, which is a standard test method for measuring deflections with a lightweight deflectometer. And to address the quality of the test, it requires the delta deflection to be less than 3%. So that's a very good indicator of the quality of compaction. When you have too much differences between subsequent drops, that's an indicator of a poor compaction or something goofy going on with the device or with the test setup. So that's also something that is implemented in the app and can be used. So overall, I mean, this proctor method for compaction quality control, it's an easy method. It uses the existing agency equipment, which is the proctor mold. It accounts for moisture variations, it accounts for stress levels, it accounts for the pavement structure, and it's a good tool to basically bridge that gap between the QC and design. And it's simple, it requires some level of expertise, but with the app, I think it's way easier, and it's really easy to be implemented. With that, I'll stop and I turn it over for questions. Thank you so much.